The ancient Greeks considered the Olympic Games to be the most important of all cultural events. For the athletes who competed, it was a chance to represent their hometown, pay respect to the king of the gods, and win fame and fortune beyond their wildest dreams. So, today we're going to take a look at what it was like to be an ancient Olympian. Okay, time to grab that ancient Wheaties box and let the games begin. The Olympic Games date all the way back to 776 BCE. Probably. That date was provided to us by Aristotle, and although there's no absolute proof of its correctness, there's evidence suggesting some form of the Games might actually go as far back as the 9th or 10th century BCE. Modern historians and archaeologists generally accept the 776 date. Also, Aristotle wouldn't get that date wrong. He had Olympic posters all over his bedroom. Held at a rural sanctuary in Olympia, which was located in the western part of the Peloponnese Peninsula, the Games were part of a religious festival that honored Zeus, the big cheese of the Greek pantheon. No one knows exactly what went down at the first Olympic Games, but several literary traditions hold that the only event was a single 600-foot race, known as the Stadion race. That sounds less of an Olympic event and more of a dare between 5 drunk friends in a parking lot. That race was won by a cook from the nearby city of Elis, named Corivos. Good job, buddy. It must have been a big hit with the crowd because the first 13 Olympic festivals consisted of just this single event. They eventually added additional, more exciting competitions, and the Games continued to be held in Olympia every 4 years between August 6th and September 19th for roughly the next 12 centuries. While the modern Olympic Games are open to everyone, the ancient Olympic Games were only open to men. Free Greek men, to be more specific. But this policy still drew a pretty eclectic mix of participants, including everything from soldiers to shepherds to philosophers. Even Alexander I, a future king of Macedonia, was allowed to participate. Despite the fact that women were forbidden from competing in the Games, a few, like Kiniska of Sparta, still managed to eke out some victories by owning the stable of horses who won chariot races. This was possible because the rules were sort of like the rules of the Kentucky Derby, where the winner of the race is considered to be the horse and its owner, rather than the jockey. Which seems fair. It's not like the jockey's running anywhere. Other women would follow in her footsteps. And by the 1st century CE, women were even starting to compete directly against men in foot races. When it came to the ancient Olympics, wealthy citizens had a hefty advantage. Although a public training facility called the Gymnasio did emerge around the 6th century BCE, the playing field was still heavily slanted toward the rich. Wealthy athletes spent their lives eating better foods, had more time to train, and could hire better trainers. It takes a lot of time and money to look like an Olympic statue. Moreover, participating in the Olympics could be expensive. Olympia wasn't easy to reach, so travel could be pricey. Athletes also had to arrive a month early to train and would have no income throughout the whole training and competition period unless they participated in local competitions. Poor athletes could always try to find a sponsor, like their hometown, a king or wealthy individual, or Gatorade, probably. But it's unclear how common these arrangements were. The ancient Olympians were competing in front of a crowd, and that crowd was typically buzzing with excitement. Spectators came from the Greek mainland, as well as the islands Ionia and Magna Graecia. They lived in makeshift campsites, buzzing with food vendors, poets, musicians, craftsmen, and philosophers. So, kind of like Burning Man, especially with all the togas. No one knows exactly how many people showed up to watch the Games, but we do know the stadium held approximately 45,000. Interestingly, married women were strictly forbidden from watching. In fact, the penalty for a married woman caught on the grounds of the Olympic sanctuary during the festival was death. The modern Olympics maintains that level of severity for anyone caught sharing videos of the Games on social media. To kick off the festivities, the athletes entered a temple and stood before a statue of Zeus so grand it was considered one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. A sliced piece of boar flesh would then be offered to them, upon which they would have to swear an oath promising to obey the rules of the Games. They pledge allegiance to a pork chop, essentially. Then, on the 3rd day, 100 bulls would be marched up to the great altar of Zeus and offered up to the gods. The daily diet of an ancient Greek consisted of things like bread or corn porridge served with vegetables, dried figs, cheese, or olives. Since meat was rarely eaten, the chief source of protein was fish. So we guess they just threw those 100 bulls away. Olympic athletes, who are typically wealthy, tended to eat more meat than the average Greek because they needed the extra protein to facilitate muscle growth. Beyond eating habits, athletes were also expected to show great discipline in how they lived their lives, especially when it came to things like sexual activity. Having sex before competition was considered a major no-no. Why? Well, athletes believed having sex prior to competing made them weaker. One famous athlete named Clitomachos refused to even discuss sex before competing and is alleged to have averted his eyes when he saw two dogs getting it on. It's unclear how witnessing that would have affected his performance in the javelin toss, but you take any advantage you can get. Athletes at the ancient Olympics were trained by a pedotribis, who taught wrestling holds, or a gymnastis, who knew the best diets, how to develop muscle, and how much exercise the athlete should be getting. Many athletes also had a sort of masseuse called an alaitis, whose job was to rub the athlete down with oil and massage them before and after workouts. Ancient Olympic athletes also consumed things that they believed would enhance their performance, specifically testicles. The performance-enhancing drug of the ancient world was testicles. And for those who didn't have any testicles to eat, they could always opt for a ground-up mix of donkey hooves and rose petals. Failing that, they could just eat live bees. I do see how that would make you run faster. You've probably noticed that modern Olympians wear clothes. Ancient Olympians, on the other hand, tended to compete in the buff while slathered in olive oil. This was probably about freedom of movement, but it presumably also made them very shiny and allowed them to blind their opponents. How the tradition of naked sports got started in ancient Greece is a matter of debate. Whatever the case, many of the athletes would scrape the olive oil off their bodies after competing and sell it to fans. Nice. Gonna turn around and sell that on Epsilon Bay. There was one exception to the whole nude competition thing: charioteers. You see, every so often one of them would wind up being dragged by their horses, so they were allowed to wear some protective gear over their more tender areas. The Olympics may have started out as a single 600-foot race, but more events were added over time. For example, the competition came to feature equestrian events like chariot and horse racing. Chariot racing was the most popular sport in ancient Greece, and the way they did it was as much like a demolition derby as it was a race. Up to 40 chariots could race at a time, and crashes were extremely common. Sort of like NASCAR, only presumably louder, because of all the horses. After the chariot races, usually came more straightforward horse racing, which sounds like it should have been less dangerous, but it wasn't. The chariot usually left the track pretty torn up, and ancient Greek jockeys had no saddle or spurs, so they were prone to getting thrown. Combat sports were also big in the ancient games, including wrestling, boxing, and the pankration, a type of no-holds-barred wrestling that was essentially like ancient UFC, only, in the nude. Those who proved themselves in these types of Olympic combat sports became celebrities and could go on to win fortunes in smaller competitions. And for those athletes who could do it all, there was the pentathlon, which included 5 events: discus, javelin, long jump, running, and wrestling. But the award for most unlikely event has to go to the competition for trumpeters and heralds that was added in 396 BCE. This genuine event that we absolutely did not make up was held on the first day of the games, and the winners were those whose sound carried the furthest. Your prize for victory was the honor of announcing the winners of the other competitions on the final day of the games, and probably some type of fancy trumpet. Being a champion at the modern Olympic Games comes with a lot of perks. Winners might get lucrative endorsement deals, become a correspondent for a sports network, or maybe even land an appearance on Dancing with the Stars. But the ancient world had its own version of prestige. Victorious athletes of the ancient Olympics were permitted to erect statues of themselves inside the sanctuary of Zeus in commemoration of their victory. A champion who won 3 times could even set up a specially commissioned portrait statue, which, let us assure you, was not cheap. In fact, a statue like that could cost up to 10 times the average yearly wage. These statues were typically made from bronze or marble, but the bases for several did. Sort of like your Little League trophies. That little baseball guy on the top always broke off. Winners also received crowns of wild olive and were showered with leaves and flowers. This form of celebration, known as the filivola, was the inspiration for the modern practice of throwing of confetti and ticker tape at victory celebrations. According to some histories, winners would become the subject of poems and songs, be sent home in a chariot, and receive a pile of money. They would also be excused from ever having to pay taxes again, which is a perk modern Olympians probably wish was still a thing. Most people associate the Olympics with the Greeks, but the truth is they were still played even under Roman rule. But the Romans had a decidedly different attitude toward the whole thing. They saw the primary value of the Olympics as a form of entertainment for the crowd, whereas the Greeks put the emphasis on the importance of the competition itself. In other words, the Romans were into the sizzle, but the Greeks were into the steak. But in the end, even the entertainment value wasn't enough. Emperor Theodosius, or possibly his son, did away with the Olympic Games around 400 CE. It is believed that Theodosius associated the games with the pagan gods, so he shut them down in an effort to help push Christianity as the religion of the Roman Empire. The Olympics would not return until 1896. At a Roman Colosseum, audiences could munch on chickpeas while watching a midday execution, or check out the lions. No, not those. And other exotic animals released through the arena's hidden trapdoors from their cramped seats, or even observe Roman elites harvesting actual sweat from gladiators to make themselves sexier. Events held at the Colosseum were so varied and elaborate that the audience never knew what to expect. Today, we're looking at what it was like to be a spectator at the Roman Colosseum. Admission into the Colosseum was free, one of the many perks of being a Roman citizen, but attendees still had assigned seating. The podium and first few rows made up the first and best tier, where the emperor, Vestal virgins, and about 2,000 other Roman elites who watched the blood sport. Merchants, government toadies, and other well-heeled patricians got to sit in the second tier. Higher up, the third tier was reserved for ordinary Joes. That's where most of the real fans would end up. Going to the games was kind of like going to Disneyland. You know, if Donald and Goofy fought to the death for the edification of Emperor Mickey. On festival days, the Colosseum attracted 50,000 spectators, a goldmine for vendors. Outside the Colosseum, traders and street sellers hawked food and souvenirs to visitors. They may have even sold programs with stats on the gladiator, sort of like Topps baseball cards of the day, that could presumably immediately spike in value thanks to all the sudden athlete death. Let's hope that Miccius Mantle Maximus card is in mint condition. As for street food, the Romans enjoyed sausages, chickpeas, and pastries. Inside the Colosseum, they could grab sweets, wine, and snacks.
Got any nuts?
I haven't got any nuts, sorry. I've got wren's livers, badger spleens.
No.
And of course, there was merchandise, a wooden ball with a special token inside. The tokens could be cashed in for special prizes, from food or cash to their own spot on an island, which, exciting as that sounds, is just what the Romans called their multi-story apartment buildings. Once visitors made it inside, they faced the challenge of finding their seats in a stadium big enough to hold 50,000. Depending on his status, a man might settle right into a nice spot at the lowest level, climb 12 to 15 stories to the top to sit with the womenfolk and the poor, who probably have the toughest time climbing 15 freaking stories of stairs. Both the entrances and the staircases were kept separate by iron and marble dividers, and like the seating areas, the passageways were divided by class. Covering about 6 acres of land and rising 12 to 15 modern stories tall, the Colosseum was and remains the largest amphitheater in the world. But although the building itself was grand, the majority of the audience was as cramped as flying coach on American Airlines. Everyone not in the ancient Roman version of the first class got a 15-inch wide seat with 27.5 inches of legroom. Now subtract air conditioning, add 15 levels of stairs, and you'd be ready to watch some bloody gladiators fight too. Because of the immense size of the structure, spectators in the nosebleed section probably couldn't see or hear much of the action. The highest part of the 15-story stadium sat upon a wall which extended 16 feet above the other spectators. The crowds at the top, made up of mostly women and the impoverished, strained to see the fights below. And while the roar of the crowd could make it to the top, the spectators in the highest seats probably couldn't hear much else from the fighting ring. This mirrors the living situation in the city. The islands we talked about earlier were about 6 stories tall, with rent mostly determined by the number of decaying stairs a tenant had to climb to get to his apartment. We can imagine what it was like to try and convince your friends to help you move a sofa. A hideaway bed? These haven't even been invented yet. As you'd expect, the emperor got the best seat in the house, the imperial box. Gladiators fought before him and appealed to him for mercy, often successfully. The emperor could order a gladiator's end at any time with only his thumb, and spectators waited and watched for his reactions. Contrary to the movie cliché, forgiveness was the rule, not the exception, and the gladiators were more likely to die from deep wounds than they were from an inverted royal thumb. While the Roman elites might sit close to the emperor, the august ruler was, you guessed it, separated from the other spectators. He even had dedicated doors to enter and exit the Colosseum, so he never ran into the rabble or slipped on lion droppings and discarded sausage. There's more sense than ego to this. Nothing inflames mob mentality like violence, and Rome was beginning to decay before the Colosseum was even built. The Mediterranean sun can be a real bastard during the summer months, but the Colosseum provided a place of respite thanks to the velarium, which is a fancy word for a really big curtain. The velarium was the building system of adjustable awnings, similar to a ship's mast and sails. A ship crew stationed near Rome maneuvered the rig. Using ropes and pulleys, the crew could pull a large piece of fabric or smaller separated strips across the top of the structure and block the sun. Ironically, that meant that while they couldn't see or hear much from their seats, the lowest class could enjoy the shadiest part of the Colosseum while the nobles sweated in the sun. It's basically like going to the movies, just to sit in the air conditioning. Fights at the Colosseum often had their own soundtrack. Spectators thrilled to the sounds of trumpets, horns, and water organs, while gladiators tilted at exotic animals and, of course, each other. Music continued even when the emperor was deciding whether a hapless gladiator had shown enough grit to fight another day. The music was more than just entertainment for the audience, though. It also served as a cue for the stagehands. The music might tell them when to release a wild animal into the arena or when the next fight was about to start, sort of like how Stone Cold Steve Austin knew it was time to run into the ring. The Colosseum had a wide array of spectacles. Though many depictions of the arena show seats surrounding a sandpit, the floor had a complex layout of walls and chambers underneath a wooden platform. Different pieces of scenery could be elevated through the Colosseum floor, providing new and distinct scenarios for every show, like the Pokemon Stadium in Smash Bros. Among the intricate caverns under the Colosseum, there were even runoff canals to drain the arena after a naval performance, called a naumachia, was performed. The wooden platform and its supports were removed from the Colosseum floor. Water was then diverted from aqueducts into the center, creating an artificial lake of up to 5 feet deep. Scaled-down ships were brought into the stadium to reenact famous naval battles from history. A lot of people, especially if they've seen the movie Gladiator, assume gladiators were all slaves or criminals convicted to die in the arena for Rome's entertainment. But that wasn't always the case. Some Romans actually signed up at gladiator schools to become professionals. For those who did, the benefits of being a victorious gladiator outweighed the inherent risks of the work. Gladiators were treated like celebrities in Rome, like modern athletes. Roman children could even buy clay action figures representing famous fighters. Victors sometimes had affairs with aristocratic women. Graffiti from Pompeii even bragged about their supposed prowess. Gladiator sweat was considered an aphrodisiac, so Romans sometimes mixed it into their face creams. Given this information, it is our duty to assume that LeBron James put some of his sweat into every bottle of his official Sprite flavor. One of the many shows held within the Colosseum was the animal hunt. The bestiari, gladiators trained to battle wild animals, squared off against lions, tigers, bears, oh my, along with hippopotamuses, elephants, deer, giraffe, and allegedly even whales. The bestiari fought a combination of both harmless and potentially dangerous animals, but the fighters were rarely at risk. Of the thousands of animals slain in a single day, many were taken out from afar with spears or bows. Presumably, that's how most of the whales were dealt with, because we can't imagine Russell Crowe wrestling with a whale and winning. Actually, maybe we can. Even though it's been highly propagated as fact, and though it is possible, there's no evidence to suggest that Christians were killed and fed to lions at the Colosseum. The association between the Colosseum and Christian suffering was first stated in the 4th century, but then largely forgotten until the 17th century. During the 4th century CE, Christian and Latin scholar Lactantius and Bishop Caesarea Eusebius wrote of emperors intentionally slaying Christians. Such actions were never imperial policy, but scattered events which occurred around the empire. The Colosseum did regularly feature punishments referred to as the Midday Games, where lawbreakers and POWs, called the damnati, were condemned through a multitude of different and horrible methods. Sometimes the damnati were thrown defenseless into the arena to be torn apart by wild animals, while others were forced to fight one another to the death. Roman Colosseum battles were like the original battle royale. After the disastrous reign of Emperor Nero and 3 other rulers, all within a single year, Emperor Vespasian rose to power and distanced himself from the distasteful image of personal luxury and opulence associated with his predecessors. Through propaganda and great projects around the empire, Vespasian established his vision as a leader who worked for the Roman people, not his own desires. One such project was the Colosseum. Vespasian personally commissioned it as an entertainment venue for the people of Rome. Over the next 10 years, Vespasian demolished Nero's private lake and in its place built the enormous Colosseum. At the time, however, no one called it that. It was instead known as the Flavian Amphitheater, after the emperor's family. So why do we call it the Colosseum? The title itself only dates back as far as the 11th century, and most historians believe it is named after the Colossus Neronis, a large bronze statue commissioned by Nero, which was once located near where the Colosseum was built. So essentially, one vanity project was replaced by another, except people actually liked the Colosseum. Used for 4 centuries to exhibit the heart and soul of an empire, the Colosseum has become the de facto icon of Rome. Its construction alone heralded the beginning of a new political environment. World War II generated some of the most amazing spy stories of the 20th century. Deceit, betrayal, double crosses. These spies have seen everything, and then some. So, today we're blowing the whistle on the wildest World War II spy stories you'll ever hear. But before we uncover these moles, his real name may have been Forrest Frederick Edward Yo Thomas, but you can call him Rabbit, White Rabbit. FFE Yo Thomas, the espionage agent with the Matrixy nickname, mostly took pictures of top-secret documents behind embassy doors in the wee hours of the morning. After serving 2 years in the UK Royal Air Force, Yo Thomas decided his missions weren't dangerous enough and requested to be sent to occupied France, where he would serve as a liaison between the French government in exile and the resistance. Yo Thomas's first 2 missions went off without a hitch, but during the third, he was betrayed to and captured by the Gestapo. Our hero attempted numerous escapes until he was transferred to Buchenwald concentration camp in Germany, where he survived 8 months of abuse before finally escaping from a work detail. In the process, Yo Thomas led many other POWs to freedom during the last days of the war. Beyond being considered one of the best British spies, Yo Thomas's legacy is cemented by pop culture. Author Ian Fleming was said to have based James Bond on him. In 1930, 22-year-old Krystyna Skarbek was a Miss Poland contest runner-up on her second marriage to writer and politician Jerzy Gajewski. Then, 9 years later, Germany invaded Poland, and everything changed. The couple headed for London, where Skarbek ended up working for British intelligence. After establishing a courier system from Poland to Hungary, the fluent French speaker took to France in 1944 under the assumed name Christine Granville. Under this new nom de guerre, Skarbek found herself navigating several intelligence operations. Her most famous jaunt was in Digne, where she tricked the Gestapo into releasing 2 captured agents, while her wanted poster was hanging throughout German headquarters. Even for the Nazis? That's embarrassing. Despite being awarded service medals from France and the UK, Skarbek was cut loose from the British government after the war. She was not permitted to return to communist Poland. and her life slowly spiraled out of control. She ended up living in a cruise ship hotel in 1952, where she was the victim of foul play by rejected suitor Dennis Muldowney. In 1935, Wilhelm Canaris thought Adolf Hitler was the bee's knees. He was even appointed the head of the Abwehr, Germany's military intelligence. Then Canaris got a front row seat to Hitler's World War II atrocities and changed his tune real fast. To right these many wrongs, Canaris started to collect like-minded opponents in the Abwehr and the military. He participated in several plots to eliminate the Führer, making sure to distance himself enough from the plan so he wouldn't be implicated. In 1944, another failed plot on Hitler's life took place, and the Führer did away with the Abwehr entirely. This time, Canaris' luck ran out, and he was tattled on by others who were tortured for the information. Canaris went to prison, but refused to admit guilt until early April 1945, when his incriminating diaries were discovered. So Canaris and his co-conspirators were rounded up and hanged at Flossenburg concentration camp on April 9, 1945. Nazis reading someone's private diary. Is there any low they won't stoop to? Odette Dalloz was born in France in 1912, moving to Britain after marrying an Englishman in 1931. 11 years later, based on the strength of some of her wartime photographs, Odette was recruited into British espionage outfit, the Special Operatives Executive. Dalloz was arrested by the Gestapo in 1943 and was subjected to torture at the notorious Fresnes prison near Paris. Throughout multiple interrogations, Dalloz refused to reveal the whereabouts of other agents in the field, so she was given an all-expenses-paid trip to Ravensbrück concentration camp. After months of beatings and isolation, Dalloz spun a tale about her relation to Winston Churchill, telling her captors that her co-spy, Captain Peter Churchill, was Winston's nephew and that she was his wife, making her the English Prime Minister's niece-in-law. SS officer Fritz Zurin, the guy who ran the camp, bought the story hook, line, and sinker, and decided this was his out from the Nazi party. He drove Dalloz personally to the American lines to drop her off and surrender, hoping her status would save him from the consequences of his actions. It did not. Dalloz ended up testifying against Zurin and anyone else who made her life hell in Ravensbrück. For her actions, Dalloz became the first woman to receive the George Cross for acts of the greatest heroism or of the most conspicuous courage in circumstances of extreme danger. The husband and wife team of Harro and Libertas Schulze-Boysen hated the Third Reich. Both came from upper-class German backgrounds, with Harro being the son of a decorated naval officer, and Libertas being the daughter of German nobility. These family connections allowed Harro to secure a position in the Reich Air Ministry in 1934, and once they had an in, they began forming a squad of like-minded anti-Nazis. As the 1940s approached, their private opposition quickly graduated to legitimate espionage, with large amounts of intel passing between them, the Soviets, and the U.S. government. This prompted the nickname the Red Orchestra, named because of how they would sing to Soviet Russia. Libertas would use her position in the German film industry to document evidence of German war crimes and pass it on via radio. But in 1942, one operative broadcast from the same place twice, which led to the Gestapo being able to locate and arrest the group, decoding messages to figure out who else was involved. The Gestapo spent the rest of that summer hunting down all the members of the resistance cell they could, eventually arresting Harro at the Air Ministry on August 31st, 1942. And 3 days before Christmas, all captured members of the Schulze-Boysen espionage club were eliminated. Aside from inspiring the Best Picture winner, the Manhattan Project made a lot of people nervous back in 1944. This was what kicked off Operation Magpie, the Reich's attempt to find out everything they could about the progress of the project. The plan was simple. Use a submarine to offload spies Erich Gimpel and William Kolpaugh near the American town of Hancock, Maine. Did we say simple? We meant really weird. After landing in snowy Maine, the pair of spies made it to New York within 2 days, which is honestly impressive. They were given $60,000 for their mission, equivalent to about 650,000 smackaroos today, which allowed them to rent an apartment in Manhattan, probably a studio, with no storage space. As is always a great undoer of mankind, Green reared its ugly head and ruined the plan for both men. Colepaw stole most of the cash and went on a drunken bender that ended up outing both spies and getting them arrested by December 30th. The two received death sentences. But since President Franklin D. Roosevelt wasn't the biggest fan of capital punishment, the sentences were commuted. Morris Moe Berg was a baseball player and coach from 1923 to 1939. Aside from being a baller, Berg was highly intelligent and multilingual, accompanying teams and players to Japan for a tour and exhibition game. On one 1934 trip, Berg filmed Tokyo and its harbor from a rooftop. By the time World War II broke out, Berg had a law degree and was involved in various counterintelligence efforts, eventually providing his film footage of Tokyo to the U.S. Army unit that planned the 1942 Doolittle raid, but not the one where animals talk. Berg was then parachuted into enemy territory in Yugoslavia to find a way to deter German progress of atomic weapons. To accomplish this, Berg placed all his focus on German physicist Werner Heisenberg. You know, the one who knocks? In fact, Berg was set to eliminate Heisenberg while he was delivering a lecture. With a concealed pistol in his pocket and a cyanide pill in his possession, Berg watched the lecture and determined that Heisenberg had not yet developed any weapon, and the assassination was put on hold. Talk about leaving things until the last minute. After the war ended, Berg was awarded and declined the Presidential Medal of Freedom, since he wasn't exactly at liberty to share the secret of why he deserved it. After his intelligence contract expired in the 50s, Berg spent the next 20 years with friends and relatives, remaining coy about whether or not he was still working on top-secret missions. He passed away in 1972 at the age of 70, and was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor, which was donated to the Baseball Hall of Fame. Albanian national Ilyesa Bosna was hired as a valet by the British ambassador to Turkey. And his new boss, the stereotypically British named Sir Hugh Knatchbull Hugeson, was notorious for bringing home sensitive, classified documents. With his new codenamed Cicero, Bosna made some cash on the side by photographing and selling these top-secret documents to Germany throughout 1944. This side hustle brought in some serious scratch, too, with Bosna earning the highest amount ever paid to a spy up until that point. Eventually, the specific details of the leaks had all signs pointing to the Ankara embassy as the source. While they had Bosna seemingly dead to rights, he was able to narrowly avoid detection during the war. After the war, Bosna learned the hard way about selling secrets to the Reich, when any new business ventures failed due to counterfeit payments from the Germans. He tried suing the government for what he was owed, but when that failed, he spent the rest of his days as a night watchman. Londoner Harold Coe had a real roller coaster of a career, starting off a villain before becoming a hero, only to end his tale as a villain again. Like a quote from a Batman movie. Cole was a former convict who enlisted in the British Army after his release. In an irony to end all ironies, Cole again found himself prisoner after being captured during the German invasion of France in 1940. He was able to escape his imprisonment and hide out in Marseille, and worked to help his fellow soldiers by establishing escape lines with the French resistance. With Cole's help, several individuals were able to escape occupied France for a better life. Score one for Cole. Cole was captured yet again, but this time the Gestapo was able to flip him to become an informer, no longer working for the French resistance, but directly against them. 50 of the captured resistance fighters were executed by the Germans as a result. Okay, I guess we have to take that point away from him. After the war, the British and French were understandably annoyed with Cole and set out to hunt him down. He was captured and placed in a NATO prison in Paris, only to escape again in November of 1945. French police eventually found him on January 8, 1946, and eliminated him. He now rests in an unmarked pauper's grave. War is truly hell, even for spies like us. The Milton Bradley Corporation produced some of the most memorable family-friendly board games in history, including classics like Operation, Candyland, and Chutes and Ladders. But the company and its beloved games have an unusual history that isn't as innocent and carefree as you might think. So, today we're going to take a look at the bizarre history of Milton Bradley board games. Okay, game on! It's funny to think that one man making the decision to grow facial hair could change another man's life forever. But that is exactly how Milton Bradley wound up in the gaming business. Bradley was born in Vienna, Maine in 1836. At the age of 20, he set up the first color lithography shop in Springfield, Massachusetts, where he decided to print and sell an image of the Republican presidential nominee, Abraham Lincoln. Despite the fact that Lincoln wasn't particularly well known at the time, the lithographs were a big hit at first. You see, Abraham Lincoln was clean-shaven until, as the story goes, an 11-year-old girl wrote him a letter mentioning that Lincoln's face would look a great deal better with a beard because his face was so thin. How did Lincoln recover from that body shaming? The child also noted, all the ladies like whiskers and they would tease their husbands to vote for you, and then you would be president. While the story may be apocryphal, Lincoln did end up growing a beard and becoming one of the most famous presidents in American history. Historians are divided on how much they think the beard affected his popularity, but some believe it helped. However, the beard also ruined Milton Bradley's career by prompting customers to demand refunds on his lithographs of a clean-shaven Lincoln, rendering them totally worthless. Bradley burned the rest of the lithographs and went in search of an entirely new product to sell. Inspired by an imported board game that had been gifted to him by a friend, he decided that his new signature product would be board games. He got to work, and at the end of 1860, he released his first game, The Checkered Game of Life. Despite enjoying success as a board game publisher, the Milton Bradley Company was almost bankrupt when World War II started. So to help with the World War II effort, and maybe to avoid financial distress, the corporation started producing missiles and landing gear joints for fighter jets. Hopefully those pieces were much more difficult to lose than the ones in Axis and Allies. It was a weird turn for what was essentially a children's toy company, but it turned out to be a big moneymaker that both saved the company and helped the American soldiers. When Milton Bradley first created the Checkered Game of Life, it was a very, very different game from the modern Game of Life we all know. Nobody loves the Game of Life when hour 3 rolls around and you're still paying off that college loan. $80,000 for a gender studies degree? How is it even legal to make that loan? But whereas the current version is just good, clean fun, the original was used to teach morality. The Checkered Game of Life featured positive squares called honesty, bravery, and success, as well as negative squares called poverty, idleness, and disgrace. A player's goal was to gain on his journey that which shall make him the most prosperous, and to shun that which will retard him in his progress. So basically, as long as you're not lazy and remain free of scandal, you'll succeed in life. Unless you land on the suicide square. Yeah, you heard that right, a suicide square. The old version sounds like a more realistic game. Players who landed on it automatically lost, for reasons that are entirely explained by the space's name. In regards to the suicide square, the rules simply stated, whoever moves to suicide is thrown out of the game. It wasn't until 1960 that the game had a makeover, opting for squares about life events like jury duty and adoption, instead of idleness and disgrace. Jury duty is not exactly a fun time, but it's way better than the suicide booth. When you think of the Civil War, you probably think of historic strategists like Ulysses S. Grant, Robert E. Lee, and Iron Man and Captain America. What you probably don't think about are board games, especially tiny versions of them. But during the Civil War, soldiers were often left for long periods of time with few opportunities for amusement. The Milton Bradley Company did their best to help alleviate that problem by producing miniature versions of chess, checkers, and other games. These travel-sized versions were sent to the Union soldiers. In fact, Bradley's creation, The Checkered Game of Life, was the country's first travel-sized game. In 1946, schoolteacher Eleanor Abbott was recovering from polio in a hospital in San Diego, California. Streaming reruns of The Office were still a few decades away from being invented, so she had some time on her hands, and decided to create a game for the polio-stricken children who shared the ward with her. That game turned out to be the now classic Candyland. Abbott made the board game very colorful and imaginative because it was intended to serve as a diversion for bedridden, severely ill children. She possibly even drew the artwork herself, although no one knows for sure. The kids in the polio helped Abbott test the game, and even suggested that she try and sell it to the Milton Bradley Company. Milton Bradley bought the game and released it in 1949 as a fill-in for their principal product, which was school supplies at the time. The original Candyland sold for $1 and was so wildly successful it eclipsed Milton Bradley's previous best-selling game, Uncle Wiggily, and made Milton Bradley a serious competitor to Parker Brothers. Candyland remains extremely popular, and the game was nearly adapted into a movie in 2012 before a lawsuit over some of the characters halted production. Even the king of Candyland has to deal with intellectual property rights. Is there no escape? Originally called Pretzel, Twister was co-created by Charles Foley, who had an idea for a game that used people as game pieces, and Neil Rabbins, who came up with a colorful mat. The idea was snapped up by Milton Bradley. But while Twister may seem like an innocent game, and has even been included in the Toy Hall of Fame as of 2015, the interactive experience used to be considered quite risque. In 1966, the game was deemed too inappropriate for the Sears catalog. Critics even called Twister Sex in a Box, which is a title that might have made it sell more copies. Due to the backlash, however, Milton Bradley halted production of the game. Luckily for Milton Bradley and the game's creators, Johnny Carson and Eva Gabor played Twister on The Tonight Show later that year, and that television appearance changed everything. The segment revitalized the game's image, and by 1967, roughly 3 million editions had been sold. If you've ever played Chutes and Ladders and thought, this game could use more snakes, then boy, do we have some news for you. Turns out, Chutes and Ladders was based on an Indian game called Snakes and Ladders. In both games, players must navigate from the bottom square to the very top one. But whereas Chutes and Ladders is now widely played as a race involving luck, Snakes and Ladders originally represented life's journey and the implications of virtues, represented by the ladders, and vices, represented by the snakes. The Indian version also deals with different planes of being and reincarnation, which maybe kids are into. Maybe Chutes and Ladders will include that in an expansion set. Sometimes irony is a toe-tapping Alanis Morissette song, and other times it's kind of just a bummer. Take, for example, the story of John Spinello, who created the prototype for the board game Operation as a school project in 1964. He received top marks on the assignment, then sold the rights to the Milton Bradley Corporation for $500, which is roughly $4,500 in 2022. That's not a small amount of money, unless you compare it to the $40 million Operation has earned for Milton Bradley since they purchased it. So, where's the irony? Well, in 2014, Spinello was in need of an operation himself, but he couldn't afford it. His healthcare wouldn't cover an oral procedure, putting him on the hook for $25,000. Spinello turned to crowdsourcing to raise money, even selling his original Operation prototype. Admirably, Hasbro, the current owner of Milton Bradley, stepped in to buy the prototype, and Spinello was ultimately able to afford the surgery. As of 2019, he was working as an Uber driver in Chicago and traveling the country, talking about his life and selling autographed copies of Operation to raise money for charity. Not bad for the creator of a game that made us hate the shape of buckets. That was impossible to grab. The Great Depression, lasting roughly from 1929 to 1939, marked a period of extreme financial distress for many people. So the Milton Bradley Corporation created a diversion from the economic hardship by releasing a game called Easy Money in 1935. That gave everyone huge stacks of cash to play with. Nothing eases the stress of a financial apocalypse like losing thousands of fake dollars to your grandma. The game was a lot like Parker Brothers' classic Monopoly, but there were some key differences. For example, players started with $2,000 instead of $1,500, and were given $250 for circling the board instead of the usual $200. Okay, maybe there weren't that many differences, which means Easy Money was a Monopoly knockoff, right? Well, kind of. The fact is, Monopoly wasn't all that original to begin with. Monopoly took its inspiration from an even older creation called The Landlord's Game, which was produced by Elizabeth Magie in 1904 to condemn people who hoarded wealth. A far cry from the game that now requires you to become a real estate mogul to win. Monopoly was created by Charles Darrow, who designed it after losing his job during the Great Depression. He tried to sell his idea to the Milton Bradley Company, but they passed on the game. Eventually, the Parker Brothers Corporation scooped up the pitch and sold Monopoly with great success. In fact, it was such a success that Darrow was the first game inventor to ever become a millionaire. Not bad for a game that nobody can actually finish. When Milton Bradley owners saw the popularity of Darrow's idea, they released Easy Money in direct competition, but Parker Brothers sued them over the imitation and won. The Bradley Company was forced to license Monopoly's patents and release a new version of their game. Interestingly, Elizabeth Magie had previously tried to sell The Landlord's Game to Parker Brothers. They passed and later picked up Monopoly instead. She eventually wound up selling her patent to Parker Brothers, who presumably bought it to prevent her from suing them over Monopoly. E.T. is a classic 80s film and is often heralded as one of the best family adventure films ever. E.T. won awards, launched superstar careers, and generated mountains and mountains of merchandise. One of these licensed products, however, is notorious for being the worst video game of all time. Today, we're talking about how the E.T. video game bankrupted Atari and ended up in a landfill in New Mexico. Atari Inc. was an American video game company. It radically redefined what the United States thought of video games in the 1970s and 80s. Atari was founded by Nolan Bushnell and Ted Dabney in 1972, and its importance in the history of gaming cannot be overstated. The company birthed the video game arcade cabinet and the modern video game industry as we know it. Atari initially began its life as a video game company called Syzygy. If you're unfamiliar with that word, it means a pair of connected or corresponding things. In this case, it was a reference to the two founders' connection. Both Bushnell and Dabney had been working with a manufacturing company named Nutting Associates to pioneer a standalone computer and screen inside a cabinet that would be linked to a coin slot that would allow a player to go on an adventure for 25 cents a try. Ultimately, they reached an impasse with Nutting Associates and partnered with Bally Manufacturing to produce video game cabinets and pinball games. Bushnell and Dabney's partnership proved to be successful, and they continued to produce games and products for Bally. In fact, they offered Bally their next product, a video game named Pong. Bally, however, was not interested, and so Bushnell and Dabney built their own Pong machine and set it up in a local Walgreens to see if it would attract an audience. And boy, did it ever. Pong was so successful they put cabinets in a variety of local bars and restaurants. Each machine was earning about $400 a week. In 1972, the duo incorporated Atari Inc. Bushnell had thought long and hard about the name of their new company. All of the names he was considering were derived from the game Go. Atari is the positioning of stones when they're in the most danger of being captured. Think of it as the game's version of The Last Stand, or when things are the most dangerous. By 1973, Nolan had hatched a plan for how to divide and conquer the gaming world. As video games started to slowly gain prominence, pinball cabinets were everywhere, having been an institution for decades. The issue with them, though, was that pinball distributors were very proprietary and wanted exclusive rights to games when Atari pitched them. So how did Bushnell get around this issue? Well, Bushnell started a side company with his next-door neighbor Joe Keenan titled Key Games. Atari would sell a pinball game, then they'd change the name and Joe Keenan would go and sell it to another pinball distributor. Basically, they were making twice the money for their efforts. This was the catalyst to allow Joe Keenan to become promoted to Atari president. Steven Spielberg, as we all know, is arguably the most successful commercial film director of all time. After rising through the ranks of New Hollywood, he crafted one of the most successful films ever, E.T., the Extraterrestrial. In today's world, it's somewhat difficult to comprehend just how looked down upon genre filmmaking was in the 60s and 70s. Much of that changed thanks to Spielberg. He took ideas like aliens and abnormally sized animals and evolved them from schlocky exploitation stories into emotionally resonant human tales that captured a generation's heart. His film E.T. is widely credited with normalizing science fiction for an entire generation. It took the ideas of alien invaders and space travel and flipped it on its head. Spielberg created a cinematic world where the alien wasn't your enemy, but your long-lost best friend. And with that emotional intimacy came merchandising, which is how we'll eventually get E.T. the Extraterrestrial, the video game. Atari released an individual home gaming console in 1977. It was dubbed the Atari VCS initially. Later, it would be renamed to the Atari 2600. The 2600 was originally priced at $199 and shipped with 2 joysticks and the game Combat. Atari initially sold around 375,000 units. 1978 didn't go quite as well. Atari, anticipating a massive uptick in sales, manufactured 800,000 units. However, people weren't flocking to the gaming system. And by the end of 1978, there were only 550,000 units sold. Up until this point, all the games being produced for the Atari gaming system had been programmed and created in-house. In an effort to try and mix things up, they decided to branch out and bring in third-party developers. The gaming industry was still basically controlled by Atari at this point, even though there were new competitors popping up here and there. In fact, Activision, who made legendary games such as Kaboom and Pitfall, was one of the third-party developers they contracted with to produce games. Activision was founded by 4 ex-Atari employees. That's how quickly the market was expanding. Atari started snapping up licenses to popular arcade games and porting them over to the 2600. Pac-Man, which was developed by Namco, sold close to $10 million worth of cartridges. Atari found their blueprint: find licenses that people were familiar with, make them into games, and then sit back and let the cash roll in. Heading into the 1982 holiday season, Atari gained a license that they thought was going to be their golden goose: E.T., the Extraterrestrial. Howard Scott Warshaw was selected to program the game, and he was the closest thing Atari had to a sure thing. After graduating from Tulane University, Warshaw was hired by Hewlett-Packard, where he worked as a multi-terminal systems engineer. However, in 1981, he was hired by Atari to work as a game designer and programmer. Warshaw's first big success at Atari was the game Yar's Revenge. Originally, it was intended to be a refit of the arcade game Star Castle, but Warshaw turned it into something entirely more unique. The game became a story about mutated houseflies fighting alien invaders. From there, he was chosen to adapt the iconic Spielberg movie Raiders of the Lost Ark into a video game. That game was a massive success. In fact, Raiders was the first video game based on a movie. Howard was on fire. He was the best designer at the best video game company. E.T. the Extraterrestrial should have been a no-brainer. The task that Atari had handed to Warshaw was nothing less than Herculean. This wasn't a project that would be served to him on a silver platter. E.T. was a delicate high-wire act. The film was a massive success, and the game's deadline was just shy of inhuman. E.T. the game needed to be programmed in 6 weeks to fulfill its holiday release deadline. A cash-strapped Atari also really needed this game to be a hit. Bad. I mean really bad. In the game, you play as E.T. as he attempts to navigate various fields that are riddled with sunken potholes. The player has to attempt to not fall into the holes. If they do, well, then they have to use E.T.'s alien abilities to attempt and fly out of them. That's pretty much the game. Believe it or not, Warshaw did the impossible. He made it happen. The game met its deadline and was released for the holiday season rush. But his efforts were all in vain. The game was critically lambasted. No one liked it. Most everyone found it exceedingly difficult to play, pointless with no story, and it was too loosely connected to the film. The game became the biggest commercial failure in video game history. Since then, E.T. has been christened the worst game of all time. To add insult to injury, it didn't help that in 1983, the video game market crashed. In Japan, it was informally referred to as the Atari Shock. In short, it was a large-scale recession that set in across the video game world. The Atari Shock lasted from 1983 to 1985. Factors contributing to the crash were market saturation, the number of gaming consoles, and the waning interest in consoles versus the renewed interest in personal computers. This wave of contracting business, coupled with the major defeat that was E.T., decimated Atari, and the company was put up for sale. A legend began to swirl through the back alleys of the gaming world that said, in September of that year, Atari supposedly took 14 truckloads of cartridges out to the New Mexico desert and dumped them into a landfill. This tale has persisted as an urban legend among the gaming community for decades. Eventually, Atari was sold to Commodore founder Jack Tramiel. It limped along for a little while and then was officially shut down. So, the question is, was it real? Did Atari truck literal tons of ETs out to the desert? In 2014, X-Men 2 and Hulk screenwriter Zach Penn set out to answer this question definitively. He produced and directed a documentary titled Atari: Game Over, about his quest to get to the bottom of what was in that New Mexico landfill. The film was first announced on December 19, 2013. Penn and his team worked on it for years. They tracked down all the original Atari employees, including the creatives, and conducted many fan interviews. Everyone had a different answer. Even the official records were spotty. Nobody could say what really happened. Eventually, Zach Penn arranged to excavate the landfill to see if there were actual ET cartridges at the bottom. A group traveled out to the Alamogordo, New Mexico landfill on April 26, 2014. Celebrities were even in attendance. Ernest Cline, author of Ready Player One, Nolan Bushnell, Howard Scott Warshaw, and legions of fans. The dig lasted roughly 3 hours, but at the end of it, they did indeed find the E.T. cartridges at the bottom of the landfill. The 1972 Munich Olympics was supposed to be Germany's redemption arc, since the last time they hosted was when a guy named Adolf was in charge. But this joyous, worldwide Olympic-sized dream quickly became a nightmare as one of the most infamous events in the game's history. Long-stemming tensions between Palestine and Israel boiled over on September 5, 1972, when a group of armed terrorists broke into the Olympic Village and took Israeli coaches and athletes hostage. It was the subject of the 2005 Eric Bana-led historical drama Munich, where the hostage situation and its bloody aftermath were depicted on the big screen. But Hollywood tends to embellish things, and it can be difficult to determine what actually happened on that fateful day. So, today we're marathoning the true story of the Munich Olympics. For now, it's time to turn back the clock. Picture this. You're West Germany. You're hosting the 1972 Olympics. The last time this happened was in 1936, when the Games were dubbed the Nazi Olympics for an extremely literal reason. The heat is on for Munich to significantly distinguish itself from those regretful times, as well as the Soviet-backed East Germans. In the interest of fostering a light and friendly vibe to the Games, security was purposely more lax and unobtrusive. This fact did not go unnoticed by members of the Israeli delegation, nor their families, who all feared they could be the target of an attack. A threat to Team Israel was apparently confirmed by German officials 3 weeks prior to the events of September 5th, but was never acted on, setting the stage for the violence to come. Week 1 of the 1972 Munich Olympics went off without a hitch, and even garnered some legendary winners, such as the Soviet Union women's gymnastic team taking the gold home to the motherland. And American swimmer Mark Spitz won a record-breaking 7 gold medals and a spot on Wheaties cereal boxes all across the USA. But Spitz's victory was only hot news for a few hours before chaos erupted. In the early hours of September 5th, 8 members of the Palestinian militant group Black September disguised themselves in ski masks and snuck into the Olympic Village with one destination in mind: the rooms where the Israeli delegation were sleeping. Black September had ties to Fatah, who, in turn, was part of the Palestinian Liberation Organization, whose ultimate goal was to eliminate Israel to establish a Palestinian state. They figured the best way to go about that was to commit acts of terror and violence against Israeli, American, and European targets, whom they viewed as the architects of their oppression. And a good way to get the most eyes on their issue was to invade the most watched sporting event in the world. Once the terrorists figured out which apartments the Israeli delegation was staying in, they attempted to force their way inside. Wrestling judge Josef Gutfreund attempted to block the door, while weightlifting coach Tuvia Sokolovsky leapt barefoot out the bedroom window to escape. 2 members of the delegation, weightlifter Joseph Romano and wrestling coach Moshe Weinberg, attempted to fight back against the terrorists, but were ultimately shot as an example to the rest of the team not to try any more heroics. By the time Black September took control of the apartments, they had taken 9 athletes and coaches as hostages. Approximately 30 minutes after the launch of the attack, the terrorists released their list of demands. The hostages were being used to ransom the release of 328 Palestinians and non-Arabs imprisoned in Israel, including 2 German militants, Andreas Bader and Ulrike Meinhof. Authorities were given 4 hours to decide on their response, or else hostages would start being eliminated one by one, with a final deadline of 9:00 a.m. One big problem with the terrorist demands dictated to the West German officials was that they had no jurisdiction in Israel, and thus could not release any of the prisoners. And when they contacted Israeli Prime Minister Golda Meir, she declined to release any, citing the effect such an action would have on the safety of her people. It was feared they would be subjected to future attacks if this one proved fruitful for Black September. West German officials struggled to negotiate further without Israel accommodating the demands. Instead, Germany offered large sums of money in place of prisoner release. All the terrorists had to do was name their price, but they weren't interested in money. The price remained the more than 200 Palestinian prisoners in exchange for the 9 hostages. While negotiations had technically failed, the terrorists did agree to push the deadline a few hours. This gave authorities the time to clandestinely orchestrate a number of unsuccessful rescue attempts. However, with somewhere in the neighborhood of 4,000 Olympic reporters and several TV crews filming at the time, any attempts to save the hostages were being watched in real time by the terrorists. The games were forgotten for the moment when the hostage situation took the main stage to around 1 billion people watching all over the world. The terrorists had indeed gotten the coverage they wanted. With Israel standing firm on its policy of no negotiating with terrorists, the prisoner release was simply never going to happen, barring some kind of miraculous change of heart. However, negotiators did manage to get the militants to agree to a deal. The terrorists agreed to leave the Olympic Village with the hostages to board a plane destined for Cairo, Egypt, where they would continue negotiations. Escaping with their lives, a free trip to Egypt, and the hostages seemed like a pretty sweet deal. The terrorists hadn't secured the release of any prisoners, but in their minds, they had brought attention to their cause and could continue negotiations, plus they had very few other options. So, Black September accepted. Here's the deal about the whole plane to Egypt deal the West German authorities offered. It was a ruse, which you probably already guessed if you've ever seen a movie. German authorities never planned on letting the terrorists walk away scot-free to transport hostages to another country. Instead, authorities would be stationed just out of sight around the airbase in order to ambush the militants and free the hostages. It was their last chance, but things went terribly wrong. When dropped into a tense life-or-death situation, most people like to think they'd be Rambo, heroically eliminating the bad guys and saving the day. But in reality, that is a tough thing to do, especially if you have to improvise. And at that time, German law enforcement, like other law enforcement agencies around the world, was not equipped or trained for counterterrorism or tactical policing. It wasn't even an idea at the time. So, for starters, the German officers assigned as sharpshooters had no sniper training, nor any special equipment, including telescopic lenses or night vision. They didn't even have armored vests to protect the small amount of manpower they deployed, for an operation that probably should have had more personnel. And the policemen who were to pose as pilots and crew members scuttled their plan at the last second for its implausibility and tactical disadvantages. This left the plane suspiciously empty. At 10 p.m., over 18 hours since the hostages were initially taken, Black September moved their captives into waiting helicopters, which flew them to Fürstenfeldbruck Air Base. Once they arrived, two of the hostage takers scoped out the plane, where they discovered no pilots, a crucial component to their whole escape plan. Smelling trouble, the two headed back to the helicopters where authorities were waiting. Police fired at the terrorists, who returned fire, kicking off a volley that was chaotically repeated until after midnight. The shootout was a disastrous tragedy. The authorities' attempt to dispatch the 8 terrorists and save the 9 hostages failed. Some of the terrorists used their final moments to eliminate the hostages, some by gunfire, others from a grenade detonated inside one of the helicopters. When the dust had settled, the terrorists had slain 8 hostages, while a 9th died of smoke inhalation. Meanwhile, 5 of the terrorists were slain and 1 German police officer lost his life. A few days later, on 8 September 1972, when the dust had settled from the whole ordeal, Israel decided to take military action. They attacked bases by air and ground in Syria and Lebanon in retaliatory attacks, aiming for targets allegedly associated with the Palestinian Liberation Organization. Israel's revenge bombing was successful in vanquishing around 200 PLO militants across 10 bases. 11 civilians were also killed in the air raids. The grim fact that all of the hostages lost their lives indicated that something had gone very, very wrong with the rescue operation, leading West Germany to open an inquiry about it. Their report was organized around 3 topics: security measures at the Olympics, negotiations with terrorists, and the rescue attempts. The West German report concluded that although there were issues based on the terrorists' intent, Israel's refusal to release prisoners, and operational conditions, there was no way to avoid the situation, and no disciplinary actions or removals happened based on the report. Case closed. And officials locked down all the documents associated with the crisis and called it a day. The lack of transparency caused many to point the finger toward a cover-up on West Germany's part, claiming that authorities had known about the planned attack but ignored the warnings. The families of the victims spent years chasing down information and justice from West Germany, until they finally reached a settlement in 2022, 50 years after the attack. Germany launched a new investigation into the massacre and paid a total of 28 million euros to the victims' family members. In a somewhat controversial move, the Olympic Games resumed just a few hours after the hostages were taken in the Olympic Village. Jeez, can you imagine having to focus on pole vaulting while that was going on? And to make matters worse, International Olympic Committee IOC President Avery Brundage had wanted the hostages removed from the village so they wouldn't detract from the Games. Real compassionate, Brundage. However, IOC officials made the call and adjusted the course. The Games were paused for 24 hours in honor of the victims. But only 24 hours. Officials stood firm that the terrorism should not defeat the Olympic spirit and the Games should continue. If you watched the Netflix series The Queen's Gambit, you've probably heard of chess grandmaster Bobby Fischer. While media like The Queen's Gambit drew inspiration from his life, the real Bobby Fischer story is much stranger than fiction. Today, we're exploring the fascinating and bizarre life of Bobby Fischer. Okay, let's set up the board. Picture this. The year is 1943 in the great city of Chicago. This is the day Bobby Fischer enters the world stage. Unfortunately, he didn't get the backstage pass, more like the nosebleed section at another stadium. His mother, Regina, was originally from Moscow. With an IQ bigger than Einstein's, she would go on to become a renowned biophysicist. At that time, she had fortunately lacked a permanent home. But she wasn't one to let life play her like a pawn. She traveled around, eventually making her way to Brooklyn in 1949. A few years later, her son would become fascinated by chess. First by playing with his sister, then by studying a book of chess games he found while on vacation. In 1956, young Bobby used his genius to become a chess prodigy. At age 13, he was crowned the youngest American junior champion. He continued his winning streak, going on to become the youngest Grandmaster title holder at only 15 years old. Geez, at 15? Most people are lucky if you can talk to your crush for 1 minute without flop sweating. Some people are born geniuses, like Nikola Tesla, Marie Curie, and Michael Bay. And despite all his quirks, Bobby Fischer was one of them. While studying at Brooklyn's Erasmus Hall, Fischer took an IQ test, where some sources say he scored as high as 195. Yet even with that great intelligence, Bobby Fischer wasn't a great student. In school, he regularly got D's and didn't quite fit in socially. With feelings of isolation, it didn't come as any surprise that he decided to drop out in 1960. He never went to college, nor did he attend any other academic institutions. Of course, if you were a 15-year-old chess grandmaster, you'd probably skip college too. For most of his life and career, Fischer dominated the world of chess. But in 1972 in Reykjavik, Iceland, he met his match against the world chess champion, the Soviet Union's own Boris Spassky. To say the championship was a big deal would be an understatement. Beyond the obvious Cold War ramifications of the match, the Soviet Union dominated the game internationally for over 30 years, considering chess a shining example of their communist intellectual superiority. Fischer, however, was critical of the Soviets, accusing Soviet players of deliberately drawing their matches. He also demanded that officials forbid cameras and hold the match away from the prying eyes of spectators. The officials refused. So, Fischer got feisty and recklessly lost his first game. Then, he stunned the world by forfeiting the second. As the championship hung in the balance, Fischer prepared to board a flight back to the U.S. That's when, among many others, Secretary of State Henry Kissinger urged him to continue playing. And because Spassky agreed to play Game 3 in a small back room, the tournament continued on. Who knew Kissinger was so into chess? He does have giant glasses. Over the next 8 games, Fischer won 5 and drew 3, winning with a 12.5 to 8.5 victory. He became the 13th world champion and the first American to win since 1886. Bobby Fischer was sort of like the Where's Waldo of the chess world, incredibly renowned but nearly impossible to find. Following his 1972 victory, Fischer refused to play by the official rules for his upcoming defense against Anatoly Karpov. So Karpov received the title by forfeit, and Fischer went off the radar. Steadfastly refusing interviews or official inquiries, He essentially gave up on the millions of dollars from endorsements that came with being a world chess champion. But he did give a bunch of money away to his favorite televangelist. Fischer renounced Judaism in the 1960s and became a devotee of a religious sect known as the Worldwide Church of God. And this sect would give Jerry Falwell a run for his dirty money. As one of the many fundamentalist Christian televangelist programs that came from Southern California, this church was into some seriously apocalyptic predictions. And Fischer wasn't just a casual fan either. He gave them $61,000 of his 1972 prize money. But just like most of these sects, things went south. Pastor Garner Ted Armstrong had a habit of getting caught in some not-so-church-friendly activities, and Fischer became so disillusioned he stopped contributing money to their cause. When Fischer did appear in public, his behavior took a turn for the strange. He moved to California, where he was mistaken for a bank robber and arrested for vagrancy. But who hasn't been wrongfully detained for a major felony, right? He even wrote about it in a 1982 essay titled, "I Was Tortured in the Pasadena Jailhouse." Johnny Cash must have heard that one and thought, dang, that's a great title. Descriptions of Bobby Fischer paint him as delusional and paranoid. He ranted about the U.S. government, indulged in conspiracies, and disregarded international sanctions on a whim. But there might have been more to the story. It turned out that Bobby Fischer and his mother were both under FBI surveillance as far back as 1942, and the file for Fischer's mother extended over 750 pages, longer than any book we're willing to read. While Fischer's mom was born in Switzerland, she descended from Russia and Germany. And when an FBI informant read letters outlining her leftist political beliefs, they naturally suspected that her inner circle was a bunch of communists. Following her death, journalists accessed her FBI file, which showed that Bobby was also under FBI surveillance, with the Bureau considering him a potential KGB recruit. Of course, this prospect seems laughable, considering Fischer was an anti-communist who despised the Soviets and their system of government. Did you see how he treated the Soviet champion? Speaking of which, of the many interesting stories about Bobby Fischer, just one of them involves dental work. According to official biographer Frank Brady, Fischer had his dental fillings removed for traditional periodontal reasons. But there's a persistent urban legend, corroborated by acquaintance Ron Grass, that Fischer actually did it to prevent the Soviets from transmitting manipulative radio signals. Grass said this about his friend: "I noticed that he was favoring his mouth, and he told me that he'd had some work done on his teeth. He'd had a dentist take all the fillings out of his mouth. I said, 'Bobby, that's going to ruin your teeth. Did you have him put plastic in the holes?' And he said, 'I didn't have anything put in. I didn't want anything artificial in my head.' He'd read about a guy wounded in World War II who had a metal plate in his head that was always picking up vibrations, maybe even radio transmissions. He said the same thing could happen from metal in your teeth." So, yeah, it seems unlikely that Fischer was a Soviet spy, considering he was so paranoid about being spied on by Russia that he may have had all the metal fillings pulled out of his head. Fischer abandoned the world of competitive chess for almost 20 years. But in 1992, a shadowy businessman and friend to autocrat Slobodan Milosevic agreed to put up $5 million to sponsor a Spassky-Fischer rematch in Yugoslavia. In the rematch, Fischer quickly overcame Spassky, who was no longer a top player. And though he won about $3 million from the match, he made an enemy of the US government, which was sanctioning Yugoslavia for its genocidal violence. But Fischer didn't care. In fact, he publicly spat on the US Treasury letter warning him of the consequences of participating in the match. Bobby Fischer, the human llama of chess. And he was not done spitting on things. The events of September 11th, 2001 will forever live in our collective minds as one of America's greatest tragedies. But there was at least one person who decided it was a good thing: Bobby Fischer. Only a few hours following the devastating attack, Fischer called a small Filipino radio station for a live interview, telling them the tragedy was wonderful news and that he applauded the act. But his tirade didn't stop there. He added his opinion that Jewish people were responsible for bringing on the attacks. His comments acted as one of the final nails in the coffin of his reputation and would haunt him for the rest of his life. Following the infamous Yugoslavia match, which violated an order from President George H.W. Bush, Fischer became a wanted man. His passport was canceled in 2003, and a subsequent warrant was issued for his arrest. So Fischer moved, or should we say fled, around the world. When he attempted to leave Japan, officials detained him at the request of the US government. At that point, Fischer begged Icelandic parliament to grant him citizenship and extricate him from a Japanese prison. It took over 9 months, but Iceland relented, making him a citizen. There, the former chess champion would live out the rest of his days before dying of kidney failure in 2008. He was 64, the exact number of squares on a standard chessboard. By the time Fischer died, he had a fortune worth around $2 million from his chess career. So, naturally, a legal fight over his money ensued. Fischer's former girlfriend, Marilyn Young, claimed her daughter, Jinky, was actually Bobby Fischer's biological daughter, so she filed a paternity suit. Young and Fischer got together while he lived in the Philippines, but by the time he died, he was an Icelandic citizen. Fischer didn't leave a will, so according to Icelandic law, the 9-year-old girl would be entitled to Fischer's estate. But that would only be valid if she were his actual biological daughter. Then things got a bit more complicated. A Japanese woman, Miyoko Watai, claimed that she and Fischer were married in 2004, entitling her to his estate. 2 of his nephews sued, claiming the marriage wasn't legal, and that since they were the closest relatives, the right to Fischer's money was theirs, and theirs alone. So how did it all shake out? Eventually, the Icelandic court allowed Bobby Fischer's remains to be exhumed, and a DNA test later confirmed that Jinky was not, in fact, his biological daughter. Then Iceland declared Fischer's marriage to Watai was legal and dismissed his nephew's legal claim. A complicated endgame for a world-class player. So what do you think? What's your take on Bobby Fischer's story? Let us know in the comments below, and while you're at it, check out some of these other videos from our weird history.